Okay, well, I'll let you for the most part.
Okay.
Might as well go to that first one, and I'm
Okay.
going to have to reduce the images here so I can see.
So this training is going to be brought to you more by Carson, because Carson sells a lot more common interest communities than I do in the boonies.
Yes, but they are a really big part of our market. And I know Michael Hartung asked about this, and you have, I know, sold quite a number of properties in this category, but I'm actually asked the question of our research statistician, but I think it's as much as 40% of our marketplace. So I may get that number. So everyone's now heard of common interest community. Our forms all start with those letters. So let's go back to, this is the first one, I think, Sarah, right here.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So these are the general types of CICs. CIC is a general, broad Minnesota legal term. You won't find it the same in other states. Andre, they call it something different where you're from, don't they, in the South?
Yeah, it's community. Oh,
I've heard, but
yeah, I can't remember right now, but it's like four letters make it up.
Yeah. And some states define them differently or separately, but here we have the four major types of them. There are townhouses, there's a condominium complex, and they are each very different, and there's a cooperative. And I'm going to touch on the cooperative because I got a little asterisk there. They almost don't fit into this except that they're a common building. And most of them in Minnesota are senior buildings. That's where an individual or a party buys into a share of a cooperative, which is like a corporate entity. So they're owning shares of the building. They don't actually own a physical unit, which is a big difference. And so the value of the unit per se may be deflated in a way, and the cost of the monthly fees are bigger because that's where most of the expense is paid. They can be very hard to finance, and so we're going to touch on that a couple times and then just kind of set it aside because we don't really work with them very often. So back to townhouses. What makes a townhouse different is that they are a legal townhouse sits on a piece of land, and you own the land and the unit, or the dwelling as it's called in the legal world, above it. So those are some distinctions. A condominium is more like an apartment or a big complex of units. In there we talk about airspace, which I'll touch on again. And my last point on that is that there's a lot of condos that look like townhouses, and I know we've run into that even when we're getting financing and details together. If they're sitting on a common garage or they have a separate door to the outside, it doesn't mean they're actually a townhouse unless the unit is sitting on its own parcel of land. So there's a big difference there.
Okay, I found this on the web for sitting on.
Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Sorry about that. But let's go on to the next one, Sarah, see what's coming up here. Okay, so why do we have them? They're common in other parts of the world as a way of living, where you buy an apartment, and that was kind of a term that was used in New York years ago before they were even classified as condominiums. But they're a necessary part of our business, and here's some of the reasons. It can be a more affordable way to live. We do it, people choose it for a lifestyle choice. If you're talking with clients where they have a life change or they want something that they can lock the door and leave and travel or go south for the winter, or however they choose to live, it can be a good option. They come mostly with shared management and lower maintenance because other people take care of that. Another thing when you're talking with clients, and a lot of what I'm going to share is how do we phrase and how do we share the information without getting all legal, so it's common language to share with our clients. Particularly in a condominium, there's far less likely to be deferred issues or repairs. I lived in a condo in Edina, and I remember seeing that they would come through and repaint the trim every spring. Most homeowners don't take care of things on that kind of a regimented schedule. Condominiums and townhouses are required to have a maintenance and a repair plan and money set aside to deal with big issues. That's part of Minnesota law. So those are benefits to the consumer. And amenities is another thing. I'm thinking of Corey, who lived in a place in Edina where there were swimming pools and tennis courts and lots of things that most of us couldn't afford with a single family house or to have by ourselves. But when we share, then we can have the advantage of all those things. So our job as realtors is really to share what the facts are about it and not steer people one way or the other. Somebody might say, I want to have a single family house, and they end up in a townhouse. We need to offer all the options. Move on to the next, Sarah. Okay. We have a CIC amendment in our purchase agreement that we use when we present an offer. This is a Minnesota law. I think I missed a word there. And the reason for this, it creates that 10-day right of rescission for buyers. Minnesota, and we can tell our clients this, Minnesota is very protective of consumers as a general concept of the culture of law here. And this is provided to give consumers a chance to review these things. And as we all know, back out if for any reason, if they find something that bothers them. They don't even have to give a reason. So why do we do that? Well, it's kind of an inspection period or a due diligence for the Homeowners Association. Because these are things, as I said here, that they may not be visible to buyers when they go to look at the property. They may not know the condition of the roof on a 10-story condominium building, or what kind of infrastructure is there, or do they have budget to fix things? So it gives a chance for someone to look at those things and decide if it's the appropriate place to live. Such as the MLS listing said, dogs are fine, and they get the association documents and it says, we don't allow dogs. Somebody might say, hey, I'm out. Okay. And again, I see a chat thing, but throw questions into chat if you, okay, that was Andre. All right. So there's 5 elements in this legal request, and that CIC amendment, the purpose of that is to formally present to the sellers our legal request on behalf of our buyers for this association information. So I don't know if we want to pull up the form now, Sarah, or we get to it later. I'm fine either way. The next slide does break down what those 5 elements are. So we'll go to that first. Okay. This is another, 5-finger thing to remember and kind of get familiar with what is included in that. And this is all detailed very carefully on our form. Explains all of this. So the articles of incorporation, that's a very simple piece that shows that they formed a nonprofit entity to become the association. It's the ownership of the whole schmoodle. Then the bylaws, which is the governing documents of how things are operating within the association and the rules. Declaration is related to that, which is stating the type of property and what its purpose is and who created it and some of those details. The biggest things for us to know about and talk with our clients about, though, are the bylaws and the rules and regulations. And one thing I'll say about those bylaws cannot be changed. The way the governance of the property, the rules and regulations can be changed very easily by the board of directors of any association. So those are important distinctions, such as they can change the rules on dogs. Bylaws don't have things about dogs usually, or bird feeders and small things like that. And a master insurance policy comes with that package, and that's sometimes something that's missed when you have it delivered to you and you have a buyer. Make sure you've seen a copy of the master insurance policy. And we'll get to that in a little bit, why that's important, because of how much does it cover? It varies a lot. And I know I said 5, there's a 6th item on here, but in the legal world of condominium and association law, a plat must be delivered with that. We don't always see that, but that's more important for a new property or on a townhouse. How big is the lot? Does it extend beyond the borders of the house? Or in the case where I live, the lot goes underneath the decking and the front porch in my house. So it is a little bit beyond the perimeter of the foundation. Okay, next up.
Do you want me to go to the form, Carson, or?
Oh yeah, let's look at the form quick, yeah.
Okay, let me switch over there real quick.
That'll be a switch tab. Thank you for doing that.
Yep.
Anyone have any questions? You're welcome to throw them out there.
So now when we're talking about, when we order those condo association docs
Yes.
for our buyers, right? And the
Yes.
seller deliver them to us. What's your best practice, or what do you think is the best practice as far as, do you read through all the documents and then go over them with them? I usually say, hey, this is really important for you. You need to make sure that you go through this as the buyer, because, and it goes along with everything we do,
Yep.
the buyer might see something that matters to them or doesn't matter. And my opinion is, you know what I mean? So I always say,
Yep, I do. It's not bad to read through them, but I hear exactly what you're saying, Michael. We are not legally responsible for interpreting that. And it's helpful to know and understand. And the more experience you have in the business, you might have some more understanding of it. But if they have serious questions about, is this good or bad, it might be a just cause to direct them to a real estate attorney. Or it's perfect. It used to be hard to do, but now it's more and more acceptable for buyers to contact the property manager and ask some questions.
and I say that too. Yeah, because that happened with that condo I was selling on.
Yes,
18th.
there were some surprises there. Yeah.
When there was one tiny sentence in the middle of all the paragraphs of the association documents, one tiny middle sentence that said, there's litigation against the property. And they didn't catch it until it went to the underwriter because it was hidden in the documents. So, and that's why I always tell my buyers too, I'm like, you need to go over this because your responsibility.
Yes. Yep. Yep. And this addendum really just details and dictates what we are expecting them to give us. Our biggest job, and where I want you to be all aware as realtors, is to know what those 5 elements are and make sure when they're delivered that you're getting all of them. If they're sending you a bunch of PDFs and something's missing, you kind of need to sort that out. More and more, it's coming from a management company where they'll send a full big package. And
I'd like
yeah.
I'd like to add something here.
Go ahead.
I do read some of the documents. I take a close look at the resale disclosure certificate, which I don't think I saw that on the list. Maybe we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I look at that. I look at the financial statements. I try to assess, how well funded the place is in terms of reserves, which I think are critically important for clients. But and then of course the rules and regulations, they need to know what those rules are. But
right.
The other thing that I wanted to add is that, and I can't remember the exact rules and details about it with regards to the state law and the 10-day right of rescission, but I know there are some exceptions, and I think examples might be associations that don't involve any kind of maintenance of the specific properties. So it might be, one of those neighborhood associations. Maybe there's a, access to a lake or something where,
okay.
Something like that.
Yeah, hang on, Pat. Now that's an association, but not a common interest community.
Right,
So,
and that's what I'm talking about, is that in those situations, there's not the state required 10-day right of rescission, but it's okay for a buyer and seller to still agree with this addendum in the purchase agreement, so that the buyer has the opportunity to look at those documents anyway.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what we're really talking about in the big picture is the concept of disclosure. That's our number one thing in real estate. It's a big additional disclosure to buyers to be aware. Sarah, maybe we should jump forward to that resale disclosure, because that kind of explains a few things. So that's the next form in your package there. This form is one we don't see very often, and Michael also asked about this document, because I have a lot of realtors ask me, why is this in our package? Because we don't usually see it. 2 purposes for this, and we'll talk further about this. If an association is self-managed, that is, there's no big management company taking care of it, then this document comes into play, because this is the request for the information to be filled out. So where there's just a two-person board of directors and one's the president, one's the secretary, they will go through and fill this out themselves, and they are required to do that on behalf of the unit that's being listed and sold. Other reason I like this document, because it reminds me of what Pat was just talking about. It kind of summarizes the things that are important for someone to know about. Are there any assessments? Are there a whole bunch of units that have never paid their dues that are bogging or dragging down the financial well-being of the association? So it's good to glance at this, because you'll know better what questions your buyers might need to ask, or what you might suggest that they look at in the larger package of information. Okay. Any questions on that right now? Is Sarah scanning down? It does give you a good summary. This is actually virtually the same list of questions as what a lender, when they're doing underwriting, sends to the management company or the board of directors, which is what they call a condominium questionnaire. It is almost identical, but it's a duplication, but they're doing it to check the health and well-being, just like the bank will check the appraisal to see if the value lines up with the offer. Okay, if I don't see any questions, so we'll go back to our regular slides here. Thank you, Sarah. Okay. Those are the 5 pieces that we need to watch for, and we can go on probably to the next one. I touched on some of this before, but we'll go through the types of ownership again. A cooperative, it's a percentage of shared ownership for the whole corporate property, and they are given the rights to use one of the units. And unit is a legal term, of course. There are often lots of restrictions on improvements, because you have to petition to the board or the corporate entity of what you can do with it before you start remodeling or doing work. The value is very different. You know, an identical size cooperative unit might be very much less value in the open market than a condominium of a similar size. They can be very difficult to finance. I think last check, there was only 1 or 2 lenders that would finance them, because there's no PID transferred with it. So let's go on to the next one, Sarah. So townhouses, I mentioned, which is full ownership of the unit and the dwelling are the legal terms for it. And that's the structure or the building and the land underneath it. And along with that, so you get delivered, or we convey a PID at the closing, which is the property identification for that unit, along with another element, which is a percentage of ownership of all the common elements. Common elements are all the shared spaces. If there's a pool, if there's tennis courts, or if it's just simply the grounds and the driveways and the parking areas, it's a percentage of ownership based on how big or square footage of your own unit, you get a percentage of that whole. And that's also the basis on how your dues are established. Financing for townhouse is the same as a single family home. FHA qualifies all the different regular types of financing. This is for a legal townhouse. Again, there's some that are tricky and look like a townhouse, and they're really a condo. Let's click on, Sarah. Condominium, you've got up to 3 different levels of ownership. So you get full ownership of the unit, which in a condominium is what we classify as airspace. It's airspace because you're buying a box. There's no ground underneath it that you have ownership of in the same way as a townhouse or a single family house. So it could be the 10th floor unit. If you think of that and explain to your clients, you're buying that box of air. You also get a percentage of ownership of the entire property. Same as a townhouse, but then there's also classifications of common elements, which is the shared ownership. In a condominium, you might have a limited common element. That's another little odd distinction, which can be a benefit. You might have a balcony overlooking a courtyard, and that balcony may be owned by the entire property, but if it's a limited common element, you have the exclusive use of it. But the upside is you don't have to maintain it. So those are things that get sorted out and looked at when the association documents are reviewed. In a condominium, the association typically handles more of the maintenance within the dues. They might have a regular schedule for painting. They may have a regular schedule for replacing the roof. If you own a townhouse, they may say, oh, the roofs are getting bad. We're going to talk about an assessment because everybody pays for their own. That's much more typical of a townhouse than a condominium. All right, let's click forward. Okay, so I started talking about some of this. PID ownership is what you get with any of these, but the PID ownership is of the airspace in a condo. It is the ground underneath the lot and the unit or dwelling in a townhouse. Common elements apply to all of those categories, which would be any parking areas. You know, it's important to look at, is there a street that needs to be maintained that's owned by the townhouse or the association? I mentioned limited common elements. Another place where those comes up is often in a large building. The parking stall in a garage might be a limited common element if it's just a slot. Some of them are owned, some of them are limited common elements. I think a limited common element is a good thing because then they maintain it, then they clean it, they pay the electricity for the garage. Sometimes you'll get multiple PIDs, particularly in a condominium. I sold a condominium at downtown in the Nicollet Mall where there were 4 PIDs and it was all of 800 square foot in the unit. They had a PID for each of 2 parking places and a separate PID for a storage garage. If we wonder why they do that, it may be the way they were purchased. It was an option, or 2 separate garage stalls. A new owner could choose to sell one of them and they have the way to convey that based on separate PIDs. If it's not separate PIDs, you can't just go and sell your garage stall. Okay, that chat was from, oh, good question. The CIC docs or the association package, Michael, would cover and include the description of all that ownership and how that works. Sometimes there's an additional, I know at a unit that I sold on Lowry Hill, they had additional property tax expense for that separate PID, which makes sense. And at the Sexton, yep. So you get a separate PID, but it's all contained in the same package. But one of the things we have to be aware of when we go setting up our title for closing, if there's multiple PIDs, we have to make sure those are all on the purchase agreement. And if they're not, we need to add them with an amendment to make sure those PIDs are listed. Because I also had a situation not very long ago where they were on the purchase agreement and the title for the buyer neglected to convey the garage stall. And the former owner was a little peeved because they continued to get expenses and tax bills for the parking stall in a building where they had left behind and sold the unit.
Well,
So,
and I was going to jump in too with
Go for
that,
it.
with my question here at the Sexton. I feel the parking garage was actually part of a different building. And so they needed to provide us with the CIC documents for that parking stall.
oh yeah, so they may be separate.
And they were, and at that point they were separate, and my buyers were getting cold feet, so they
Yeah.
almost were pulling out. And because I represent my buyers, I was like, well, in this case, I mean,
Yes.
you do have another set of association documents that you have to agree with, so you do have another 10-day right of rescission. They ended up buying it anyway, but it
Yeah.
was the listing agent didn't even realize that it was a separate CIC until we were 3
Yeah.
weeks before closing. So
Yeah,
it's
great question. I have seen that a lot where a listing agent does not know some of those details, such as, is there a separate PID for a garage unit? And that's really important to ask, or a storage unit.
Can I add into something, Carson?
Go for it.
If you are the listing agent, as we're seeing, you need to do your research on what you're listing, because
yes.
there are different PIDs, and a townhouse can be a condo, even if it looks like a townhouse, and that's going to affect financing. Just you
Yes,
have
it
to
is.
do your research if you're listing a CIC type
Yep.
property.
And I've got that category just on the bottom of this slide, a manor home or a townhouse style. They even have manor home in our listing details, and it kind of annoys me because it's not really a legal definition. A manor home is one that is a condominium, which may have a common garage, but it has its own front door. So that was the marketing and sales term for that property, trying to make it sound better, truthfully. Yeah, and it's really nice. It's a benefit to have your own front entrance and not have to go down a long hallway. Because one of the things that I talk with buyers when they're looking at condominiums, particularly when Michael mentions a place like the Sexton or a downtown unit, I ask them to think about how they feel about the journey. That is, do you drive up and park, in the Sexton case, across the street in a different building? And what's your journey to get to your front door? Do you have to go down a long hallway and turn a corner and then turn another corner to get to your door? Or is it a quick step off the elevator in a tower like the Summit Towers and your door is right in front of you? I ask people to think about that because they get caught up in the unit and forget, well, gee, I have to carry my groceries, or I don't want to do this. It's just helping them value what works best for them. Okay, so is this the next page, Sarah? Okay, next one, we'll move on. We have to look at what the dues include. I know Corey had this, and we were trying to sell units at the Summit Tower because people at glance look at the dues and say, $875, whoa, why would I ever buy that? Well, it depends on what they cover. It may be a perfect lineup of value and expenses. Does it include heat? Does it include internet? If you buy a single family house, you might pay $100 or better for garbage, sewer, water, and recycling. And that's included in this. So it's our job to kind of break it down and help explain it. We want there to be a contribution to the reserve balance. Look at that, I typed the word twice. This is good. And consider the age of the property. It makes a difference. I mean, there's a lot of condos downtown that were built in the 80s. Fortunately, many of them have been renovated since then and have a lot of the issues of that vintage taken care of. But that may have ended up with big dues because most of them had to replace windows. If they start replacing elevators, and if the assessment for those things is all done and the renovation is done, I would say that's a great time for someone to buy in that complex. But that's something to consider. Another comment on the age of the building. This is very anecdotal, but it seems to me that associations that were set up in the 80s and 90s have lots of restrictions on pets. Places built since 2000s generally allow dogs and pets and are fine with that. It's just a cultural shift, but if that's important to a client, we need to look for that in our search. So assessments. In the legal world, anything that's paid to an association is an assessment. So let's set aside the monthly dues because that's an assessment, but those are established and are often called fees. That's a set amount that rarely goes down. It usually goes up over time. But then we are also looking in the documents to see if there's any assessments proposed. Goes into that purchase agreement, is there assessments for the street on a single family house or new utilities? There's more layers of it possible with an association property because the association might levy or propose assessments. They're going to build that new elevator and it's going to cost $50,000, and then we have to look and see how does that break down and what does that mean for the unit. So won't get in too deep on that, but if questions come up, we can certainly address them. Let's jump on, Sarah. Insurance requirements are different for living in an association property. It may be cheaper in some ways, but there's other layers to look at. In that package of 5 elements, the one that I said is often missed that we want to watch for is the master insurance policy. That's one big umbrella insurance policy for the whole complex, whether it's 380 units, like one of my properties, or if it's 40, like where I live. It may be inflated because of tennis courts and swimming pools that have more liability. The other reason for needing to look at that policy statement is to see what does it cover. The next item is personal property insurance. That's what the client buys on their own. And in a condominium, it usually is just your personal belongings and furniture, and you hope walls in. Walls in is a concept which means if something happens in their kitchen or between inside the unit, you want insurance to cover some of that, but it's much more like what rental insurance would be for an apartment. So this is one of the affordability things. Can be a nice transition for a first-time buyer not to have to be responsible for more than the apartment size unit. Okay, when I say fill the gap, insurance has gone up substantially over the last 5 years. So what many associations have done to create an affordable insurance package for the master policy is they've increased the deductible amount. Often they go up to, some of them are $10,000, some of them are $15,000. So when I say fill the gap, you would be wise to have an additional small insurance policy to cover that difference. If a tree falls on my house, the master policy has a $10,000 deductible, and that's not going to go very far in fixing my house. So that gap insurance is not expensive, but it's a good reminder. Insurance may be billed as part of the dues. So you pay $287 a month and the insurance is included. That's pretty common in a condominium. It's more and more typical in townhouses for that to be pulled out, particularly with increasing insurance costs. And now that insurance is an extra bill of $90 or $100 per month. Those are often something people can pay quarterly, monthly, or even annually. We can move ahead, Sarah dear. Okay, so it's important for us to pay attention and understand this. I just got that statistic from David Arbit, Pat. So it's a 26 to 30% of the market are CICs. So there's more data that I can break down there, but that's a general thing of kind of interest. So they're a big part of our market. So we have to understand and know how they work. Management companies come into play. There's some that are good, some that are not so good, some that charge a lot of fees. The most frustrating thing is when we order those documents Michael was talking about, is the management company that charges $300, $400, $500 just to get copies of things that they have sitting in a PDF somewhere. That is frustrating, but it's a money-making thing. Self-managed condominiums and townhouses, they can be a very different animal. Going back to the forms, that's where we need that fill-in-the-blank resale disclosure. They can be good things. I know Sarah looked at one where it might have been a good thing because they may not care if you do an Airbnb rental, because smaller associations that are self-managed tend to have fewer rules and are a little more loosely run. Can be good and bad. Management companies, if you're living there, are a buffer, and it's a good thing. If you have a 3-unit condominium building and your neighbor's bothering you, it's really hard to address that directly. If you have a management company and they can issue, please clean up your driveway or put these things away that are Christmas decorations that are still out in June, that other party can make those messages and make those statements. So something that might become a whole other class is the entity itself. That nonprofit entity called the association, you own a part of it, but it also has rights. If somebody isn't paying their dues, they can enact, legislate how that those things get paid. They can charge extra expenses. They can file judgments and claims against the owner if they don't pay those things, and they can ultimately foreclose, and they have a ranked order in the foreclosure process of some rights of getting back that money. So, I mean, that's a whole other detailed subject of the law. So we'll jump over that and see what's coming up here. I just mentioned that homeowner associations are established as a nonprofit entity. That's what the declaration and the articles of incorporation state in the documents. 15 years ago, Minnesota updated the statutes on associations. And this is what we call MCIOA. Minnesota Common Interest Ownership Act is what that stands for. It creates a new set of statutes that governs how associations are created. So any property built after that law was put in place has to follow that law. But I will say from experience, more and more associations, particularly with management companies, are pressing their associations to adopt this law. There's a lot of good things about it. It was specifically designed for condominiums and works much better for those than for townhouses, but it does have some regulations that are really important, such as reserve requirements. There has to be a reserve, and there's guidelines on what that is. Because before this law, there were a lot of associations that said, well, we just don't want our dues to look very big because we'll never be able to sell them. And they wouldn't put away any dues, any reserves. or a townhouse with a lot of seniors that got together and said, we can pay for things when they come up. We're not going to pay, I don't want to pay up front. But now there's rules and guidelines on that that really help, because it's really good when there's something big that comes up to have some money put aside for it. Requires them to have a reserve study that says, when are we going to need to replace things over the next 10 years, and kind of estimates what those will cost. So that reserve study is another requirement of McIowa. I think that's about the end of the package here. Let's see what comes up next, if anything. Aha, lots of initials. I just was poking fun at that. CIC is the broad general legal term. HOA is the Homeowners Association, which is created legally to manage and run that and share the ownership. Townhouses, obviously, and then the law. So any questions or discussions? This is a really big picture overview. There's a lot more legal details and how ownership and interest and how the guidelines and rules are determined. But anybody have any thoughts? Or whoa, I guess not. Let's see who's all on board here. TT. Jenny. Hi, Jenny. Joanne. Andre, is this substantially different than how things worked in North Carolina?
No, not that. We didn't have as many variations. We really didn't have, inside on Hilton Head anyway, Hilton Head Island, we didn't have condominiums at all.
Okay, wow.
So we basically just had what we could, condos were called villas down there. So you would have a homeowners association, a community and common community docs for that. Yeah.
Okay.
And we didn't have nearly as many forms as you might imagine.
Yeah, Minnesota's a little crazy. Yeah, I know. There are a lot.
A lot more detail here, yeah. And there was no right of rescission.
Yeah.
There was no 10 days right to review.
And since this came up in conversation with you, Andre, there is an option to reduce the 10-day period of the right of rescission if somebody determines after a minimum of 3 days that they're fine and comfortable with it, and they want to, or have an agreement where the property is pending, they can remove that balance of that time. So we do have a form for that as well. Another thing that would be worthy of mentioning, and it's sometimes hard to tell in the before the last recession, there were a lot of rush because we didn't have enough condominiums for the need and the interest that people had to buy them. So there were a lot of apartments that were converted to condominiums. It's a complicated process. The downside might be the building really was not built to operate as an individually owned unit. Might not have separate utilities or as much insulation in the walls. Visually, it may be hard to tell the difference, but when somebody converts an apartment, it's a big project because an apartment building, no matter how many units, has only one property identification code. And with even a condominium, there has to be one per unit or one per parking stall. So they have to have engineering drawings done and divide them. It's rather complicated. And the last thing just to mention, there's more and more creative condominium options out there, such as, what's the place called by Southdale at the Galleria? Pat, you're right there. What's the name of it?
You mean the Westin?
The Westin.
Or the hotel there?
Yep,
or you mean
the Westin
okay.
at the Galleria and the Ivy downtown Minneapolis are two examples of condominium hotels where there are people who own a unit in there, which just like a condominium ownership, but they have not just an association to management, but a front desk with some services, and the owner has the ability to rent that out like a hotel when they are not in town. So it's a combination of hotel services on top of condominium ownership. And the Ivy works like that as well downtown. A way for them to support even more amenities. I know there's some downtown that, you know, they will drop you off at the door or bring your car to the door for you and have.
We had a couple of those on Hilton Head. Very difficult to finance, almost impossible to finance.
Yeah, they can be more challenging, yes.
Private financing.
It's a pretty high-end concept. Yeah. Any other questions or ideas?
Oh, Carson, I want to add, since you mentioned a lot, and most of this happened about 15 years ago, but a lot of conversions from apartments to condos. And one of the other challenges was that many of them were smaller, like 4-unit brownstones. And then
Yes,
you have the additional challenge of when there's only 4 units, if one person's not paying the association dues, that's like a whole 25% of the revenue that's not coming in, which is
correct.
a challenge for the association.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm going to flip my phone around and tell me if you can see the little bars from InfoSparks here. This just goes back the last year, and there were over 4,000 condos sold in the Twin Cities and almost 11,000 townhomes sold.
Yeah,
So as you were mentioning, it's a pretty big number, between the two of them, about 15,000
yeah.
sales in the last year. So
Well, and it's a really important part of our marketplace. And as realtors, it's not our job to diss or dismiss them.
right.
Because it's again, it's a lifestyle choice, and it may be, there's prices. You can buy a condo that's $2 million downtown Minneapolis, but on the other end of the spectrum, it may be the best first time option for many people to get into $150,000 to $250,000 townhouse. I know Andre and Joanne just worked with a daughter who that was a great first house and came out well selling it. But it's kind of nice. I mean, people when they retire sometimes. It's not bad to see the snowplow going by and cleaning out your driveway at 6 in the morning before you have any need to go out.
Mhm.
There's good options with that.
Yeah.
And many more creative things like Pat talking about a converted mansion that has a bunch of different units in Crocus Hill and St. Paul or Cathedral Hill that no one unit is the same as the next one. It can be a lot of variety. So it can be a really interesting way to live and get you into some different options. So
Yeah.
little details we need to know, and our job again is to interpret and help people walk through them and field their questions. As Michael said, and as Pat said, Pat probably reads the budget and wants to look at the numbers.
No doubt.
Well, and no, it is a good thing because there are a lot of buyers who just don't have that mindset and may not ever look at it, and it will become important down the road if something comes up.
And I think too, like one of the things with the condos and the associations, especially for the location of our main office being in Minneapolis,
Correct.
with all the condo associations, I've helped a lot of condo buyers
Yes.
in downtown Minneapolis. So the more you kind of know how to deal with them, especially where our office is located, we're going to have a bigger market than, let's say, out in Waconia or out in Lakeville. You're going to have townhomes, right? But it's not necessarily going to be the kind of skyscraper condos.
Right, there'll be a different type of housing, but again, speaking of Prior Lake and Lakeville and Burnsville, where our south office is, there is a whole swath of townhouses, many of them identical, and so many of them with 1 or 2 car garage and 2 or 3 bedrooms and a whole row of them lined up. Some of them were not well built, and there's still so many of them that come on the market. I had a couple who were really frustrated because the value was not going up very much because there was still so much competition in that category. It's gotten better. And then we have to look at the ones that have had some improvements done on them, and you get to look at that or see a place that, wow, the siding on this building looks really tough. I wonder if they're going to fix that, and is that going to come up and bite my buyer after a couple of years of living here? So things for them to ask questions before they get into it. I know I've got an association property and there were 3 swimming pools and it just became way too expensive, and they actually closed and filled in one of the pools. Probably okay, but that adds insurance cost and liability. Newer properties don't build with some of those amenities because of that. It's good and bad, but they're built closer together on less land. Probably don't see swimming pools very often anymore, just like you don't see wood burning fireplaces. Risk and liability.
Yeah.
So, well, let's see what we have coming up next week, Sarah. We've got 2 subjects fit into our Tuesday class. We're going to talk about lending in the COVID-19 marketplace, and which is important because we're seeing a lot of sale activity and pending sales, aren't we, Pat? I mean, it's just crazy how much, and showings are fairly strong.
Yeah, the new report that came out yesterday showed actually a significant spike in showings.
Yes.
Which was interesting. Pending sales are down just a little bit more, so the average is 130 something per day, but you know, maybe that's going to start to pick up with all those showings we had in the last week. So we'll see.
Yeah. Interesting competition. The other half of the program class next Tuesday is going to be about navigating home warranties and where they can be a benefit when we list or sell a property. So.
Good.
Yes. Good training next week. So we'll have a couple guest speakers in.
Yes. Yep. And if anyone drives out into the hinterlands, it's just a passing thing on the freeway for Sarah, but we have a listing going on the market in St. Cloud. So good values in that neighborhood. If you know anybody up there, if you know any other realtors up there, we can pass that on. Do we know how much that's going to be, Sarah?
About 200,000.
Okay. Yep.
4-bedroom, 2-bath split, or no, 3-bedroom, 2-bath split level.
Well, that's a bargain.
Yep. Very nice newer home.
Yeah. Yep.
That'll be good.
Anybody else have something new coming on this week? We don't have to wait for a month to share listings. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, the state. Yeah, that's good.
Right. Yeah. Because we're in announcements right now. So I'm on the Minnesota State Association of Realtors Communications Committee. One thing we're doing right now is we're launching a new website. It's really slick, works really well. And what we're asking for is for agent testimonials. So once that launches, if we could get everyone in the office to hop on and take a look, what we're going to do is if you submit a comment like, this website's really sleek, they're going to put your card, like a card that changes each time down at the bottom of the website. So it'll say like, Deshari Thomas, EXIT Realty Metro says, this website's great. And so each time you go to click on the website, that new agent will pop up. So if we have more realty representing,
why not take advantage of it?
Right. And that's the same thing with that Facebook post that I shared as well. If you're doing anything special for the community, share that because they're also putting that on the website. And if you go on the website now, it's all Edina Realty. It's all different companies. And that's what our liaison from the staff said too. She was like, listen, she's like, everybody in our committee, get your offices to participate because that's really going to show, our team spirit, a lot more exit. So if you guys have any questions about that, feel free to reach out.
Excellent.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
And then coaching on Mondays at 9 a.m. Carson will start.
Yes. Yep. We're going to go back and do that in the Zoom mode, which we haven't done before, but we feel it's important to get back on track with that. And please message me if you have any interest in either being an ambassador or wanting to sign up for having an ambassador to support you. Our newest agents will get an ambassador program as they begin, which is a good thing, but let us know on that. And and thanks even to Michael Hartung for asking a question about CICs so that we could delve into this a little bit more. I hope that has been helpful and gives you an overview and maybe some phrases to use when you're talking with clients. And we appreciate everyone's engagement and involvement at this time. I think we're having some good support on doing things on Zoom and we're all getting a little better at it. So, and thank you, Sarah, for managing the presentation slides.
No problem.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Have a great day. Keep asking
Thank you.
questions. Keep connecting with